Alright, here we are, round 2 of the Q&As. I know it was, quite a few months ago when I did the last one about Midsummer, but here we are again now. I thought because we hit 50,000 subscribers, I figured why not do another Q&A round. Now, I know last time I answered questions a bit more, personal stuff, background, whatnot, but this time I want to, of course, I think get more into the historical stuff, what you're really here for, not me, of course. So, starting off, I want to get into some of the Patreon subscriber questions first, and then I will come back and we can get into the YouTuber, questions, the questions on YouTube here. So, with that said, let's dive in. So, the first Patreon question comes from Michael B. He asks, what are your plans for the channel? Do you plan on covering other parts of Japanese history? Also, who do you find to be the most interesting person during the Sengoku Jidai? Well, my plans for the channel, when I first set out to create the channel and whatnot, the whole point of it was to just cover the Sengoku Jidai. I wanted to cover it, piece by piece. I wanted to cover it like a series, beat by beat essentially, similar to the way the Great War covered World War I. I wanted it to be this kind of episodic thing, and I know I couldn't necessarily do, month by month, week by week, but I could do, important beat by important beat, major battle to major battle, key events. So that was the big thing I wanted to do with the channel, and of course now we're getting close to the end of the Sengoku Jidai series, and I'm going to move on and do a series that goes into the Edo period, but there's a lot of stuff I could get into regarding samurai history as a whole, not only how we look at it in forms of media and our popular idea of it, but also getting into the nitty-gritty and in talking about popular misconceptions and stuff. I've already made videos like my video talking about the truth behind Bushido. So there's a lot of things we could get into still going forward. In terms of other areas regarding Japanese history, my focus is definitely with the samurai, so I don't want to go too far out. If you're looking for more of a broad history channel, once again I recommend Linfamy, of course. He's of course broad all Japanese history, and especially folklore and stuff too, where I'm just specifically focused on the samurai. And if I were to talk about my favorite person of the Sengoku Jidai, which is a very hard question to answer, you can't just necessarily pick one person. Who's more fascinating than Oda Nobunaga? Seriously, the guy who really kickstarted the unification of the country and really pushed the whole entire nation into, the modern era. Alright, next up we got Patrick Dereza. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name, buddy. I know you from the Discord, but I don't necessarily know how to pronounce your last name. Now, you do have a number of questions here, and I'm going to try to get to all of them because I know you are not only a Patreon subscriber, but you, of course, are a longtime supporter of the channel. Your first question is, will you do any movie reviews of NHK taiga dramas? In time. I'm not the biggest fan of taiga dramas. That's not to say I don't necessarily really enjoy them. I just have yet to find one that I really vibe with, I guess. They're a little bit kind of cheesy for me to say. But I do want to eventually start getting into some taiga dramas. That is something I do want to eventually do with the channel. Because there's a lot of them and it'd be cool to dive into them. Number 2, where do you see yourself after your channel has 100,000 subscribers? Where I always keep on moving forward. I don't see any change. My content is always going to try to be what it is, what I've always wanted it to be. You're not going to see too much of a big difference unless I somehow get a team behind me helping me make videos, which would, be awesome, but I don't necessarily have the money right now to pay a team to help me with that stuff. Number 3, any updates on your move to Japan? Well, I was supposed to move in January, but unfortunately with the new strain of COVID that came out of the UK, Japan closed their borders again, so it looks like I'm waiting till March now. We'll see what my company will do. Yeah, it's up in the air. I'm not holding my breath anymore. I'm kind of just going with the flow at this point. Number 4, speaking of Japan, any plans to visit Sengoku battle sites? Of course, absolutely, and you can bet that I'm going to film every bit of it and document it and make sure to make videos of it for the channel because that is something I really think would be awesome to do. And number 5, is there a possibility that you will redo your previous videos? That is something I've thought of a lot, actually, because I know a lot of my earlier videos are pretty rough, not only technically, but in a lot of parts I've gotten things wrong. So I have thought a lot about coming back and redoing past videos, specifically my setting the stage stuff and my early Sengoku Jidai series videos. That is a project I may come back to do in the future. I don't have any plans right now in the immediate future to do that, but in time you may see me do that, kind of a redux. Just have to wait and see. So those are the Patreon questions I got. If you are one of my supporters on Patreon, please don't miss this opportunity to go and ask questions, because I will always give you guys first come, first serve with these Q&As going forward. But now let's get into the questions that you guys submitted to me here on YouTube. So the first question I have is, could you talk about the military hierarchy on the battlefield, such as ranks, chain of command, etc.? This is something that is kind of hard to discuss in terms of samurai warfare, and I've kind of talked about that in the past. The samurai didn't really have kind of a chain of command hierarchy the way that we think of, specifically, maybe a Western mindset. They didn't have ranks, really. They, of course, the higher ups you can consider generals, the lower downs, you can consider, officers and whatnot, and then there's, of course, the daimyo and, the clan family members. But really it's hard to kind of branch our minds over it to understand that they didn't have ranks the way we think of ranks. A lot of what we think of, especially when we think of, higher ups in command, usually is won by, merit. Those who, have displayed their ability to lead are usually put in charge of other soldiers. Going all the way up to, from, leaders of Ashigaru going up to, generals. And then there's, of course, the clan family members, which get, of course, priority over anyone else. So it is something that I do want to talk about at some point in the video. It's going to be a hard video to make, specifically because we got to detach ourselves from the idea we think of when we think of, titles and command and chain of command. Was Toyotomi Hideyoshi's disastrous war on Korea a mistake for Japan's future? Yes and no. You could, of course, make an argument that, it really did weaken Japan in a sense, but it also displayed just how powerful Japan was at the same time. So it was disastrous more for the Toyotomi family than it was for Japan necessarily. It definitely ruined the Toyotomi. It didn't necessarily ruin Japan. It certainly, in regards to Japan necessarily being a force that could go off and invade and become this powerful imperial element in Asia, it did kind of seal off Japan's fate regarding that. But you can make all sorts of arguments about the Tokugawa and their decision to later close the country off and whatnot. There's a lot more that gets into it. If we're just talking about Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his failed invasion of Korea, it was a disaster for his family, more than Japan is the way I would phrase it. With the success of Total War 3 Kingdoms, do you think that would be the best setup for Shogun 3? I'm kind of thinking about how you're asking this question. Are you asking like in the terms of how you see, the game, Shogun 3 kind of working with the kind of hero system that is in 3 Kingdoms and also in, Total War Warhammer? That would be interesting to see in a Shogun 3, but I'm much more a fan of the traditional Total War style. I don't necessarily need the kind of hero system that we see in 3 Kingdoms and we see in Total War Troy and Total War Warhammer. And I would much rather see just a really well polished, amazing historical Total War title than something with all these flashy heroes and leveling up and whatnot. And on the same train of thought, before we ever see a Shogun 3, we need a Medieval 3 and an Empire 2. I do not want to see a Shogun 3 until we have a Medieval 3 and an Empire 2. Those come first. We need those sorely. Which clan of feudal Japan would you be a part of and why? The Tokugawa. They won. Would you consider producing animated battle maps for conflicts throughout the Sengoku Jidai? Of course, if I had a team of animators, which I could pay. Can you check a game called Shigatari? You may like it. I actually have that game. It's kind of interesting. It's pretty funny. I do like that game. Yeah, definitely. I'll make a video about that at some point. Will the channel cover the Imjin and Boshin Wars and Japanese external wars? Of course. Yeah, the channel is going to cover the Boshin War and the Imjin War. In particular with the Imjin War, and I am going to get more into what I mean by this in the next Sengoku Jidai video. But in terms of the Imjin War, which is going to be a part of the Sengoku Jidai series, because I do consider the Imjin War, as a core part of the Sengoku Jidai, I'm going to only do maybe, say, 3 parts to it. Or maybe even 2 parts. I'm not going to go super in depth. There are a lot of channels here on YouTube that already go through the Imjin War very well, and I will point those out in my next Sengoku Jidai video. I'm going to do my version of it. It's not going to be super crazy. It's going to be more just like why it's important, what happened, and happening in the course of the Sengoku Jidai. And my biggest focus here. Not only is to, of course, remain, accurate, but also is to help hopefully tell the story of what's going on in a very entertaining manner. As I've said before, and I continue to say, I'm first and foremost, in regards to the way I go throughout telling the history of the Sengoku Jidai, a storyteller. I was watching a review of The Last Samurai when this thought came to me. What if it was one of the other 2 unifiers who won in the end instead of the Tokugawa? I was just thinking that, what if it was Nobunaga? Would he still have closed Japan's borders like Yayasu did, or embraced the West instead? Nobunaga is very interesting. In terms of closing the country down, I don't think he would have. He was too much of a fan of the West, I think. I've talked to people who say that Nobunaga maybe was using the West as a means to an end, but I think from what I've seen more, Nobunaga definitely kind of flirted with the West. He, of course, dressed in a very Western manner. He brought Christians in all around. He paraded them. He was really enthralled by, Western commodities. He loved Western firearms. He was completely taken away with it. And of course, yeah, you could make the argument that a bit of that was, of course, just using it as a means to an end, particularly with firearms and technology. But I do not see him whatsoever closing the country down if Nobunaga were to have, succeeded in unifying Japan. And then there's, of course, the question regarding, it was his idea initially to invade China. So I definitely think if Nobunaga would have won the Sengoku Jidai, you would have seen Japan enter the world stage in a much larger fashion than, of course, Hideyoshi did, and obviously Tokugawa closed things off. Nobunaga, I think, of any of the 3 unifiers, was the most ambitious and unorthodox. Have samurai ever been accurately depicted in any film or TV show? This is a really interesting question. Movies and TV shows have portrayed samurai many different ways over the years. In older films, samurai really take on this kind of uptight, deep voice kind of mentality. Toshiro Mifune and Tatsuya Nakada, their performances in a lot of these older samurai films, these classics, they really paint this kind of just dramatic portrayal of the samurai. And then in more recent films, samurai, of course, become a bit more kind of dramatic in a different sense, flamboyant, jumpy, kind of a bit more wacky. So it's hard to pinpoint what is realistic and what isn't. Have I seen really a portrayal myself that I think would be the most accurate? I think the portrayal in The Twilight Samurai, if that's the name of the film, I think that one is fairly accurate to what maybe would be have historically been what the samurai would have looked like. Of course, that is set during the Edo period. So in terms of the Sengoku Jidai, I'm not necessarily sure. It's hard to tell. It really is. we can, and this is kind of what I was getting into in my video, talking about what did a samurai battlefield look like. Unless we were there, it's hard to understand what it would have actually been like. We have these ideas that we definitely have, of course, through writings and illustrations and everything, but we don't necessarily have, a solid, image or idea of the atmosphere of what it would have been like. We can only try to imagine how close it would have been. This is actually a good question for a video down the road. I might even, pose the question or throw it back at you guys. What do you guys think would be the most accurate depiction that you think you've seen of samurai on film? Because I'd love to see what you guys think. Do you plan to do a series on the Ginpei War? Would love to see that. Well, of course, I did my video on the Ginpei War way back when. That, of course, was just one video, and obviously it's a bit more rough. It's one of my first videos. I have thought a lot about coming back, and of course, as I said, to redo a lot of those. And I have thought particularly about the Ginpei War. I would definitely love to come back and make a whole series on that. Obviously, I want to finish the Sengoku Jidai series first, and then I gotta move into, my Edo period series. That's down the road. I definitely have thought about it, though. That is something I kind of do want to do at some point. If you had a time machine to go back in time and watch any battle take place during the illustrious golden age of the samurai throughout all periods, what battle would it be and why? Great question. So the immediate thought that popped into my head was probably Kawanakajima, just because of, how famous that battle is and how romanticized it was, and I would have loved to have seen, what it looked like in reality. But I couldn't pass up the chance to see Sekigahara. If you've seen my top 10 samurai battle videos, I consider Sekigahara to be number one. The greatest samurai battle of all time. It just seems like it would be so massive and incredible to witness. I don't think I could pass up the chance to see Sekigahara. Not so much a question, but a suggestion. How about a top 10 most influential / successful clans during the Sengoku Jidai list? I actually do like that idea. I had a similar idea. It wasn't just focused on the Sengoku Jidai, but it was, of course, throughout all, the history of the samurai. I wanted to talk about what were the greatest clans throughout, feudal Japan. I think I want to save the idea of just focusing in on the Sengoku Jidai for a little bit later, because I could come back and really do any of my top 10 lists that I've already done and just talk about, the same thing, but specifically during the Sengoku Jidai. Top 10 greatest samurai leaders of the Sengoku Jidai, top 10 greatest samurai warriors specifically of the Sengoku Jidai. I'd rather do, these top 10 lists in broad first before I start narrowing down on certain key periods. But definitely a great idea. Thank you for suggesting it. So I think you were asking in this one, when will the next video of the tournament be out? So Triple Z Hacker, if you may know from Discord, and obviously he's the YouTuber and Twitch streamer who's working with me to put out the videos for the tournament. He will have the finale out soon. Also, congratulations to Triple Z Hacker, because he actually did win the tournament as well. He is the champion of the Shogunate, and he got the prize and everything. He will have the finale up soon. I will announce it on Twitter and Facebook, and probably here as well. And then going forward from there, I'll probably announce, I'll probably make a follow-up video just talking about, how the tournament went and changes I think I'm going to make going forward for any future tournaments we do, because this last one did have a number of kind of stumbles along the way that I think we need to fix and iron out to, go forward. So keep an eye out for that. I will, of course, notify any way I can in social media, so when it's finally out. If you could interview any Sengoku Jidai samurai lord on the workings of policies, politics, and field of battle tactics, which samurai lord would it be and why? It'd be close between Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, but I think I'd go with Hideyoshi. He's right in the middle of it. He's the guy who, at first unified the country before things fell apart again. But he definitely saw everything Nobunaga did. He would have had opinions on it. He himself, of course, was a very good, skilled strategist and probably the best siege expert Japan ever saw. Of course, and he had opinions regarding, not only internal workings of how he wanted the country to be shaped going forward, but then also, ambitions abroad as well with his, gambit to go and attack Korea and China. You may be wondering why I don't choose Yayasu, and, he'd be a very awesome, interesting person to interview as well, but I think we kind of all understand Ieyasu's mindset rather well at this point. I just think it'd be really fascinating to try to understand a bit more of Hideyoshi. What was the rationale behind Tokugawa Ieyasu moving the capital from Kyoto to Edo? Well, he didn't really move the capital. The capital still stayed in Kyoto because that's where the emperor was. But the shogunal government was located in Edo. Of course, the reason for why he would want to keep his government in Edo was because he already had his government there. He had already established himself there. He had, been there for the past decade, building up at that point. Everything he needed was there. His power base was there. His influence radiated from that spot. He didn't need to move his government over to Kyoto and get entrenched into the politics of Kyoto. We see, when the Ashikaga established themselves in Kyoto, they kind of got carried away with, the cultural side of the city and everything, and the politics and the inner workings, and it kind of bogged everything down. And of course, as we know, the Ashikaga got very weak. To keep them separate was a good idea. We saw the Kamakura Shogunate do this, and they were very powerful for their time, at least for a while. And of course, with the knowledge of what worked and what didn't work with the past two shogunates, Ieyasu was very set up to create, the best one yet. And obviously, of course, in Kyoto, he still did have a lot of power, and that is the importance of Nijo Castle in Kyoto, where he essentially made it where no one could, go see the emperor or, go to the imperial court without going through Nijo first and, getting clearance. So he had a stranglehold grip on Kyoto as it is. So it really came down to just, did he need to go there? No, he was already in Edo. So you have these two powerful cities in different parts of Japan, and of course, following, the fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate, it made all too much sense for the emperor to then pack his bags and move over to Edo, and, at that point then we have Tokyo. Alright, and for the last question, how do you think a late-stage Sengoku Jidai force would stack up against the preeminent Western armies of the day, Spain or the Ottoman Empire? Now, this is a very interesting question. There's a lot of similarities between these armies. I'm not the best expert on Europe at this time, obviously. I'm more focused on just Japan. But, you do have historians that point to Japan being one of the most powerful forces in the world at that time, particularly in form of land military. You have, as I stated in my most recent Sengoku Jidai video, people who have, their whole life has been war. Generals who can call on a lifetime of experience. Soldiers at the peak performance and discipline. Huge surplus of military equipment, top of the line firearms, the best firearms actually in all of Asia at that time, the most mass produced firearms in Asia. In fact, Japan was shipping firearms all throughout Asia at that time because they had the most, because they producing so much for the wars in Japan. You could really say Japan could hold their own against any European power on land at that time. It's hard to say who would win, of course, because we don't necessarily know, but they would have definitely been able to hold their own. And then the second part of your question asks about if gunpowder and firearms had not been introduced to Japan by the Portuguese, how much of a big change would that make on the Warring States period? Well, then, of course, you'd have to ask, would the Dutch have introduced it when they came? It would have been pretty big, obviously, because we wouldn't have, major revolutions in samurai warfare like at Nagashino. Would it have changed the period outright? Yeah, there would have been a lot of big differences. Probably it would have really shaken things up. To an effect we don't really know. You also get into your question. You start asking about what tactics and strategies would have been different. I think it's too hard to tell sometimes, because I don't think it would have necessarily impeded the rise of Nobunaga, but it definitely would have been something that would have maybe been a detriment to his strength overall. Specifically, you know, and you do kind of allude to this, you know, the strength of the Takeda with their cavalry. That would have been a huge thing to deal with. I think Nobunaga, being the military genius that he was, would have still found another unique way to deal with the Takeda cavalry. He had a lot of ingenuity, obviously, so he would have still found ways around it. That's the key thing to take away from Nobunaga, and of course the way he led was so unorthodox. So it would have been big, it would have been different, it would have changed a lot of things had gunpowder and firearms not been introduced. To a degree, don't necessarily know. Samurai warfare would, of course, continued on a lot like we would have already seen in the past. I don't know how much of a change it would have gone throughout the final decades of the Sengoku Jidai. And of course, then you don't really know when the Sengoku Jidai would have really come to an end, because it would have changed things up so drastically, probably. But it still would have come to an end. It would just probably have been a little bit of a different year. But yeah, it's a hard question to answer, but still a good one to ask. Alright, and those are the questions that we have today. Of course, I really like doing these Q&As, and you can expect a lot more of them in the future. I'm going to, of course, space them out, you know, usually the same, you know, length in between that, you know, this one had to the last one. But thank you for everyone who asked questions, and I'm sorry if I did not get to your question this time around. And once again, if you also didn't have your question answered, make sure to check the previous Q&A to see if you may have already had, you know, your question answered in that. But anyways, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting, informative, or however you found it. And if you just like samurai history and, you know, like the content I make, thank you so much once again for helping me reach 50,000 subscribers, and I look forward to seeing you guys again very soon.